Well, welcome again to my podcast, Kari. If you are listening in and a listener, you remember that I had Kari back a couple of months ago, and I've had several people tell me that we've got to have Kari back. And so today's devotion is something that aligns right with Kari. And I was like, you know what? She's going to add so much value to my podcast today. So I definitely wanted to add her in on the conversation. So today, the title of the devotion that I wrote is called Am I Clay? And we're on day 150 on 365 days of walking through the Bible alphabetically. And we're on May the 30th. So we're moving right along in the book of Jeremiah. So today's morning rinse is Jeremiah 16:18 or 16 through 18. And the featured verse is Jeremiah 18:4. And that verse says, "But the vessel that he was making of clay was spoiled in the hand of the potter. So he remade it into another vessel as it pleased the potter to make." And so you're probably wondering, like, well, what's Kari have to do with pottery? And so if people don't know who you are, Kari, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit and tell the audience how we know each other?
Well, my name is Kari, and I have known Anita. Oh, goodness, Anita. I don't know how many we've known each other, like 8 years, something like that. 7, 8 years.
Time.
Quite a while, yeah. Met through the film industry, and I'm an actor and an editor. I also do some script consulting and assistant directing and all things movie making. Just a storyteller, I guess. Ultimately, is that I'm a creative and I really enjoy all the different areas of the arts. So I have dabbled in kind of basically anything in the arts industry that you can imagine. I have many different interests, and I really enjoy learning new things and learning new skills. So
that is so fun. Yeah, we met. Was it at a film festival? Was it?
I think so. I'm trying to remember, actually, and I'm really bad at remembering, I guess, the first time I've met people, but I'm pretty sure.
I feel like it was a Christian film festival called Christian World View Film Festival.
Yeah.
And we had like a house full of people. And
was that the first time? Yeah, that might have been it.
Yeah. So we randomly just plugged into a whole bunch of people who were going to do this Airbnb, and we didn't know anybody hardly there. We're just like, yeah, put me in a room, put me on a bed, I'll take it. And I think that's how we met. If I remember correctly, you were staying in that same house, I feel like.
Yes, I think so. That was the year that I got the really big house. And so I had a few friends that we were all going to go together in on an Airbnb. And then we found a really great deal on a really big, beautiful house. But then we were like, well, we need to fill it. So each one of us were like, all right, well, I'll reach out to these 3 ladies that I know, and I'll reach out to these 2. And so it was kind of like friends of friends came in. And I think that's how we ended up with the.
That's what my memory serves. I feel like. So, it's super cool that, we have that connection, not only with film and commercials and storytelling, but it also links to today's podcast and the subject of it. I'm sure that we've all seen like those videos of this master potter who's molding clay on a pottery wheel. And, some of us have had the privilege of witnessing this, what I call underrated art performed in person. And I'm actually learning how to wheel throw, but you've actually witnessed it. Again, there's this like intricate machine these potters work on, and it's designed to make these circular ceramic pieces like vases, plates, cups, and all kinds of things on wheels. And sometimes even they form like extremely exquisite and unique creations. And mine, obviously, I call them personality driven because there's lots of flaws in my wheel throwing right now. And it's a really long process, and it requires like intentional patience from the potter, which I am still learning that patience, But you actually had some pottery experience growing up, right? Tell us your story of, how you were introduced into clay and pottery and all of that, and that will bring some perspective for the audience.
Sure. So I had a privilege of getting introduced to clay working actually really early. It was really a neat thing. So through my grade school, when I moved after third grade, so starting, I think in fourth grade in our art class, every grade school you have your art classes. We had this wonderful woman who happened to be the grandmother of my best friend growing up that would come in and do a kind of unit on clay working, and she was phenomenal at everything she did. And we call her Grandma Vandy, was her name. And she would come into the grade schools, and at first she'd just bring in like pre-made little like masks and little clay figures that had already been fired once and were just ready to be glazed. So that we kind of began that experience of glazing a piece of work and then seeing how different it looked after it was fired. And we'd also, before we'd glaze it, sometimes we'd do some little etching and tweaking on it to make it our own, and put our little artist signature on the back and stuff. So it was just a special process that I got to start at a young age. And she carried that through working with the grade schools. But because she was also my best friend's grandmother, I got to experience it from beginning to end. So we would go over to her house because she lived in the neighborhood. And actually often my parents and my friend Tracy's parents were still at work. And so we would go and hang out with Grandma Vandy right after school. And she just had shelves of molds, and she had all the kilns and everything like that. So we got to see her fill these molds with clay to make the different figures. And we got to see her firing some of our class work. And I kind of got like a behind the scenes view of the whole process at a young age. And then as I continued through school, I continued into art classes and then started to learn different techniques of wheel throwing and coil pottery and things like that. And just a lot of different ways of working with clay, because it's not just one. And it's neat when you get to learn all of these different techniques. But that was starting in grade school, and all the way through high school, I got to continue to work with clay in different ways.
So when you were talking about like the process of, going from the very beginning all the way up to the end product where you're actually glazing. And if people don't know what glazing is, that's when you put different colors on it. Glazing is another form called paint, and they just use the word glaze so that I don't know where it came from, but that's people dip their pots in big buckets of glaze, and then you can put several different layers on it. And when it goes through the kiln, which is where they fire it, it comes out sometimes mysteriously because you don't know how the glaze is going to actually respond to the firing. So it's super cool. But one of the very first steps in the whole entire process is called wedging. And that's this process of getting out all of the air bubbles, because when you wedge the clay, it helps to eliminate cracking, it helps to eliminate shattering, it helps to eliminate those air bubbles that are in that can actually make it explode later in the kiln. And if wedging is done manually, it's like very similar to kneading bread dough. You have to squeeze it, push it, twist it, the whole bit. And this whole process is part of what the potter does in finding like those hard spots to remove, even, that maybe have dried up or whatever. And then once all that preparation of the clay is completed, then the potter actually will gather his tools and then start to turn and throw the clay, or do hand building or wheel throwing or whatever. That's kind of the process of it. Did you ever get to see her actually wedge as well, or are you familiar with the wedging process?
Oh yeah, I was able to also then do it. So that was something I was taught how to do, and actually something that's fun, especially when you're thinking of it on a bit of a metaphorical plane when it comes to our own lives and being able to be formed, is that often, especially with newer artists, one of the first things you do with that lump of clay before you even wedge is you chuck it down on a table really hard.
Yeah.
Like you just smack it down, you just toss, and it's getting some of those larger air bubbles out and up to the surface. And then after you've done that a few times, then you go and you start to wedge and work it like you were saying, like you do with bread. But sometimes you got to start out pretty rough with just tossing it and whacking it on a hard surface first, before you can even start to wedge it and work through it.
Yeah, that is true too. So I'm taking these wheel throwing classes and learning my skill on it. And yeah, you're right. That's, you throw it down. And I've always just thought that it's just kind of this fun little thing to get kind of connected to the clay, and just kind of get your mojo going on. But yeah, I can see where the importance of it is, just to start getting those bigger air bubbles out, and before you even start to wedge it.
Yeah, and it can also tell you, based on how it lands, if it is the right consistency, or it has the right moisture content to be able to even begin to start to wedge it. Because if it thunks a little bit more like a hard softball, then it's too hard, and there's not enough water in it. Or sometimes if it splats, you're like, okay, I can't wedge this. This is just going to goop everywhere. So then it's too moist. So that's the other thing, is it can really help the artist know if the clay is ready to be able to even spend the time with starting to wedge and mold it.
That's so good, because we've got to be ready for Jesus when he comes to actually mold us, and is our clay ready? And then so after the wedging is done, then there's this process of shaping the clay. And, from a wheel standpoint, that starts like, you're talking about throwing down on the table. When I have like this ball of clay and I've wedged it and I grab the amount of clay that I want, that's like the other step, is I throw it down onto the clay or onto the wheel, so that it kind of gets connected to the wheel in a way, and then your wheel gets, I think of the movie Ghost. I think a lot of people who are listening to this can relate to that movie, as far as the ghost, that ghost movie. And then around and around the clay spins as that potter gently molds and guides and shapes and moves, squeezing it, and then sometimes crushing it down, and it starts all over again and making this perfect where, basically. But literally, like that, part of that whole process is to get it centered. And the centering on the clay is so important, or on the wheel is so important. It's almost like you can't build a strong foundation of a piece without being centered in it. And it's such a spiritual connection, a spiritual concept of it. Because even when the potter is molding and making and crushing it and doing it over and over again, it still has to remain centered.
Yeah. And what happens if you don't throw it quite hard enough into the center, and it doesn't stay connected to your wheel?
Yeah.
It's also not going to work, right? Like it not even just centered, but it also has to then stay stuck to your wheel. Because I know there were times when I'd throw and I didn't get it pressed down to the wheel, to its spinning foundation, the foundation that's going to start to form. It didn't get connected enough, and then you step on that pedal for the wheel to start spinning, and there goes your clay. You're like, no. Yeah, I had it perfectly centered.
Yeah. My instructor actually has taught us to seal the clay onto the wheel by turning the wheel and pressing down on the very edges with water, like water on our hands, and how water will suck onto it. And it's so interesting how God uses water for so much throughout the Bible. And as he grows and shapes and molds. And then this masterpiece is created, and then the potter sets it aside to dry. And then once it's dry, puts it in the kiln, which is what you had mentioned. And the kiln actually will fire and harden the clay, and can sometimes take up to like 1,500 degrees Celsius in the kiln. Like, that heat is so high. And this is when the ceramic piece is converted from that weak clay that can actually just fold apart by getting wet into a strong, durable form. And this entire process of molding clay on a potter's wheel, or just, hand making it, is no different than how God wants to mold us, like stretching, pushing, removing our hardness, shaping, putting us through the fire. All of that sounds like super cliche-ish when it comes to like a Christ-centered life, but his desire is to be that true potter by molding us on his wheel and then creating that unique life that he has for us. And as you have been around clay, and as you have been around, just the arts in and of itself, is there anything that that sticks out to you through this whole process of, God being the potter and us being the clay, and some of the processes that you've, gone through in years of working with clay? I mean, me, it hasn't even been a year, but you've had a lot more experience with observing and making things.
Yeah, actually, you had mentioned about how neat it is that God uses water, and it made me think about, we say, and it's not just even in our spiritual lives, but we talk about like being able to be malleable and learn and grow and be moldable. And what I think is really interesting is that, and we're talking obviously prior to that firing process, because that's when everything really kind of gets set. But if you have a clay piece that starts to harden too much, and gets like really hard, where it's not like you can just kind of add a little moisture to it and rework it, but it's like completely dried out, but it hasn't been fired, that clay isn't useless. You take that clay, that dried clay, and you submerge it in water, and you leave it soak in that water for a while. And it just has to soak in that water and start to suck it all up and to rehydrate from the inside out. And then it will become malleable again. But it's a hard process because, and I don't know if you've ever had to do this, Anita.
Yeah,
but
I have.
Okay, so and if you sometimes, if you're wanting to entirely restart a process, that you will soak that clay until it can get to that moisture content again. But often, if you want it to be fully malleable and smooth, it will actually get sent through a machine that kind of like grinds it. And so that it completely, like, it's almost like a blender. You're just like, it's not easy on the clay. But then that is what makes it smooth and even and malleable again, to be able to be reworked, so that clay is not, it's not just something that gets thrown out because it got dry and old. It can just be resubmerged into that water. So if you think of it on a spiritual level, to think of that, like, some people just feel like they're just like, I just feel dry and empty and useless. I can't do anything for God's kingdom anymore. And maybe that's just an invite to submerge yourself in God's water, in his word, in his presence, and just soak. Like, there are times in our lives that we just have to soak. And we are too dry to be able to give, to be molded, to do things, and we just need to soak in that, in God's presence and in his word. And sometimes we got to let him even kind of grind us up a little bit, because it hurts and it's not an easy process. But what can come from that is then again to be able to be this fresh ball of clay that can then be molded into what the potter wants to mold us into. And I guess I love that clay isn't ever too far gone, and that it can be so even if you're on that wheel and say you were working it and it broke apart, well, that doesn't mean you throw away that clay. It's not useless. It's not done. You just, as the potter, are reworking that again. And I think that clay can be such a beautiful visual of the fact that we're never too far gone. We're never too far broken. There's even a really beautiful process that can happen after clay has been fired and glazed, in this re-gluing of maybe a piece of pottery that's been broken. And again, it's just, we're never too far gone. I think that the potter is always viewing his art and viewing us as something beautifully and uniquely made, and there are never two alike. No matter what, you can never get two exactly alike. Even when they're made in a form. So like I was talking about with Grandma Vandy, and she had these molds that she would fill. Even those came out unique. There were still, even if it was more subtle, they were still unique little differences about them. And no two were ever exactly the same. And it's that beautiful piece of art that we're unique and we're special and we're different and we all have our own purpose. And purpose is another thing that the potter gets to determine what he's making and what the purpose of that is. And some of them are very utilitarian type things, and they're going to be used for bowls and vases, and some of them are just beautiful works of art that look pretty, and there's everything in between. And they all have purpose, though. They're not just made to then be tossed in the garbage, or the potter would have never spent their time making it in the first place.
Yeah, each one of them has a purpose. That's so interesting about the hard, dry clay that, you were describing. I have several pieces that, I'm still learning, and it is hard to wheel throw and to get the skill and the technique. What my challenge is I want to get it done like right now. And what that happens then is it becomes all twisted, and then there's things about it that I don't like. And you can definitely tell that my process kind of can sometimes get a little quicker than what I want. But then there's times where I know exactly what you're talking about with, you make something and then you just don't like it, and it sits there and it gets super, super dry. And I heard once that clay and the hobby and the skill of clay is one of the few artistic forms that you can actually use the product over and over and over again. And I have a friend who said that for a month, all she did was take the clay on the wheel. She would make something, and then she would fold it and let that piece dry out enough to actually make something again. And it's like you can just continually use that clay for whatever she wanted to make the next day or whatever. And so having it be in that moldable shape is the key for us spiritually. Like you said, if we just feel super, super dry, it's so important to get soaked in the living water of the word. And I guess the big question, for the audience and for people listening and reading my book is, will we submit to his way of, gently shaping us? Or, if we feel really dry, like you said, will we submit ourselves to the process of getting soaked in the word so that we can become moldable and shapeable, even if God wants to crush us and reshape us again and again and again and again? Are we willing to go through that with him? And then, once we're made into, what God wants us to make, are we willing to go through that fire of life with him? And I think it's just so important to be willing to submit to that and to ask ourselves, like, am I clay to God? And if we are, then this allows God to make us into what he wants us to be made into, and what he needs for his kingdom ultimately. Like, you were describing all the different things that can be made with pottery. It's just all of it is just so vast to me. But we first have to be willing to be his clay.
Yeah. And I think we need to be willing to be patient, because when you were talking about how, because you're learning this process, but as the artist, when you're starting to mold something, and you've thrown it and you're spinning it and it's not quite turning out the way you wanted it to. If you go through the process of restarting, you're going to ball it back up and restart. You didn't do that because you hate the clay. You did that because the clay was starting to mold into something that you didn't intend it to mold into. And so you had to start over, and you were like, all right, you're not taking the form I intended. We're going to start over because I have this vision. I have this picture of how I want you to turn out. And I'm going to be patient. I'm going to take the time, and we're going to keep working you until you get to that place. So as the clay, are we patient enough to be like, all right, I will let you continue to rework me. And there are going to be times in my life where I thought that I was getting close, and then I felt like I just got all balled back up again and starting from the beginning again. And maybe it was because I was close, but I wasn't quite right. And so the potter was like, we need to start again. And then we just restart. It's not, the potter didn't do that because the potter hated me as the pile of clay. It was because I wasn't quite turning out the way the potter intended. And so the potter needed to restart. And so it's a patient process. And sometimes we get close. And so then as clay, we're like, hey, I'm there. And the potter's like, yeah, but no, it's just not, sorry. Like, you're right, we're close. So you can maybe grab a vision of what you're going to look like at the end, but we're not quite there and we need to start over again. And so, but it's never out of this, like, I hate you, ball of clay. I'm angry with you, ball of clay. Although sometimes we get frustrated with that ball of clay for sure, but it's never like we would just want to be done with it and we're going to throw that ball of clay away and grab a new one. We're just going to keep working that one because we want it to take that shape and that beauty as the potter that we envisioned it to be and that we know it can be.
That is so good insight. And, interestingly enough, it coincides with today's daily challenge. The challenge for today that super coincides with it, because the challenge that I had listed for today was to look inside our hearts and see if there's any recommitments that we need to make, maybe rededicating areas of our life to God so that he can keep reshaping us, and ask God if there's any area that we need to be okay with starting over, and ask him to help us be clay in every area of our life, because there could be areas of our lives that, we're doing really, really fantastic over here, but this one little area, we're not letting God shape us. And, it all affects, the whole entire piece. When I talked about wedging, it's getting out those hard pieces of clay that's in the big starting piece. If we left those hard pieces of clay in the ball, it can affect the whole entire finished process. And our challenge needs to continually be okay with, if God says, I'm needing you to readjust some things, and recommit to like being moldable for me in my kingdom. Having that as a challenge and searching our heart every day for every area of our life is such a great way to answer the question, am I clay for God's hands and for his kingdom? And, having the fires of life sometimes will show us whether or not we are truly moldable and shapeable clay because of the way that we respond to those challenges. So,
and if we're struggling to submit to that, it's probably because we need more water.
Oh, that's so good. Yeah, I mean, and even when you're sitting on the clay, if the clay is too tough, yeah, you're right. I mean, if it's too tough and it's, not moving in the same way, the process of it is to add water to that ball of clay as you're doing it. So that's really good. And so, that's how, if somebody were to be listening to this and maybe they're newer to faith or newer to, Christ, when you say, if those are areas of life that are a little tougher and we need to add water, what are some ways that are tangible that people could add water to their soul?
That's a good question. I think there's lots of different ways. I mean, there's obvious ones like reading God's word, and sitting in God's presence, which would just be to find a quiet place where there's not a lot of distractions and just be willing to listen to God, because he's always there. But sometimes we just don't acknowledge him. Talking with God. I think it can also be getting around a community of other people that are also in the water, as we'll say, that are also getting their daily dose of God and his presence and his word, and having a very rich and water filled spiritual life. When Jesus said that we'd never thirst again, he is that water for us. So in whatever way we can get more of God, and there are many ways of that. Some people, it is just being out in God's creation and soaking that up. I mean, we talk about soaking that up, and I think there's a reason we say that. It's because what do you soak up? You don't soak up hard objects. You soak up water. You soak up that moisture. And so getting God's word, God's people, God's creation, and God's presence, and any way that you can get any one of those things. But I think sometimes we have gotten so distracted with things that are not of God that has begun to dry us out. And even just having other people around us that are good and rich and malleable can help.
Yeah, it's good to have accountability, and being around people can help us grow. Yeah. So every day I have an evening reflection, and I ask people to pull out their journal and just kind of reflect on the podcast and the devotion for that day, and pull their journal out and write down something that they took away from that day, whether it's conversations that they had with God or whatever. So today's reflection is to write down basically what area that God talked to you as a listener about today, and be honest with yourself. I mean, yesterday was all about being honest and talking about being honest, if you listen to that podcast. And it was just about, we can go to God and tell him how we're feeling. Do we still feel like there might be some little hard parts in us, or do we feel like we're soft clay and moldable? And is there an area that he's dealing with you about, and writing down that, because it's so important to kind of be able to not only be the soft clay and to be willing to be moldable, but also be honest with where we're at and where we're feeling. And if we feel a little dry, we can go to God and share where we're at with him. But being moldable is so key. And to ask the question, like, am I clay? Or am I not?
Right. And you know what? I was thinking about it, and you and I have the shared experience of working with clay on a level of artistry, of wheel throwing and things like that. But I would venture to say there's a huge percentage of the population that has also experienced that if they've ever played with Play-Doh. Like, it's such a simple version of clay, but at least to a certain extent, you know what it's like to open a little canister of Play-Doh and it is become dried out. And you know that you can't make the things you wanted to make with it because it just doesn't work. But you also know you don't hate your Play-Doh if it didn't work the first time, but you're going to keep making it into new things. And like you were talking about that person, you knew that like just uses the same piece of clay and just keeps making new things. I mean, that's what we did with Play-Doh when we were kids, is we didn't make a thing. I mean, some people maybe made a thing and then just left it and let it dry. I don't know anybody that did that, but I mean, might be some people that did that, but most people, you kept playing with it. It was the process of forming things. That's where so much of the beauty and the art and the enjoyment came from. It wasn't necessarily even that final product. It was the process of forming and reforming.
Play-Doh is such a great example.
Yeah.
So good. Yeah, I remember for the most part making sure that the colors stayed with the right container. Every once in a while I would mix some of the colors, but for the most part I liked the colors to stay what they were. Yeah, and the disappointment of when our Play-Doh got super dry, you couldn't do much with it after that. And that's such a great insight, because when we are hard, God can't do much with us. He's got to like, okay, well, you've allowed this to be a part of your life. You haven't soaked with me. You haven't spent time with me. And so therefore you've allowed your heart to be hard, or allowed things into your heart that just festered things. And I love that, we have to submit to God in order to change our form. We have to submit to him and to that water in order to not be dry anymore, and to then become moldable by him. That's such a great analogy.
We're just a lump of clay doing nothing.
Yeah, we're just sitting there in a ball of clay.
Yeah, nobody wants that.
Yeah. And then when he just makes it into this masterpiece and fires it, with the hard parts of life, that's all part of becoming who he wants us to be as well. And so
I asked the question, who's your potter? Because if you look at a piece of art, you can usually tell who the artist is. So I asked the question first, who's your potter? And is God your potter? Are you allowing God to be your potter? And then if when someone looks at you, the piece of art, they should be able to then see the potter in the art. And so beautiful art and really good art is recognizable, or the artist is recognizable by their art. So you can look at an incredible work of art and you can tell who the artist was, even if the artist isn't there, even if their name isn't anywhere around the piece of art. You just by looking at the art, you can tell who the artist is. And so my question is when someone just looks at you and looks at your life, can they tell who your artist is?
Oh, that's so good.
And I think that's what makes it beautiful, is that there's this style, and sometimes it's you don't even know why. So, like Anita, you were saying, like maybe it's you can tell because there's like cracks or flaws or things like that. But I think there's times when you look at art and I'm like, there's not like there's this line and this particular shape or this thing that this artist always does. You're just like, I don't know why I can tell who the artist is. I just do. So I was talking about my daughter, and when she was like a sophomore in high school, and she's been an artist her whole life, but I started to notice when I was looking at her projects that she was developing such a style. And I could walk into the art room and I could immediately know which piece of art was my daughter's.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't because it had her name on it, and it wasn't because I had seen her working on it or something. It was just because it had her style. But if somebody were like, okay, describe what her style is, I wouldn't even know how to put it into words.
Mm-hmm.
I just knew it. Like you become so familiar with it. You become so familiar with the artist's work that then you can recognize it even when it's a new piece.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so that it's kind of that indescribable thing that you can sense about an artist. But I guess I would just encourage people to ask who your potter is, and can people tell who your potter is by looking at you?
That's so good. Such a great conversation, Kari. I always love your insight into life. And I knew that you would bring some great perspective because of your experience growing up with your adopted grandma, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Grandma Bandy was the best. I adored her so much. And she taught us so much. And I just have such visual pictures of her rooms and her house just full of all of these beautiful artworks. And it was definitely that introduction at a younger age that just gave me so much interest in the possibilities that could be with clay and with forming it in all the different ways. It's just, yeah, I was very, very lucky to have had that experience with her on such a regular basis, and that she was so willing to pour into me, into my friend. I mean, it's her granddaughter, so it's a little bit more, I would hope so. But for me, she didn't have to do that, and she did, and we just had so many wonderful times. And as we got older too, she allowed us to help a little bit more, and it was just it was really, really cool thing that I got to experience, that I know was a very unique experience that most people don't get to have. So I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah, that is a really unique experience. And it's cool too, that just like this verse, how that, the featured verse, making the clay from the hand of the potter, so he remade it into a vessel as it pleased the potter to make. And I love the word pleased in this whole entire verse, because can you imagine, like me, I get all giddy when I'm at the wheel, and that truly shows that I'm like enjoying myself. And then I want to get it hurried, done, and fast. And I get so excited when I'm making something for somebody else, and want it done like right then. And I imagine God like looking down at the wheel, like our lives, and he gets giddy when we are moldable and shapeable. And I can just imagine he gets so pleased with being able to work with our lives, especially when we don't resist him. And I guess that's kind of my big overall picture of looking at that whole entire verse, as he just is pleased, and he makes it into the vessel that he wants us to be, as it pleases him to be made. And I guess the word giddy might be a little too giddy-ish, but
no, but I think it's appropriate too, because you bring up a good point, which is that the potter never sits at a wheel because they don't want to. Like, the potter wants to work with the clay, and it's enjoyable for the potter. Like, this is a process that's desired for the potter. The potter isn't like, oh my gosh, I gotta go sit and work with the clay, or the potter wouldn't bother. Like, it's an art form. You don't need to bother with it. But you get excited because you know all of the possibilities that are sitting in that lump of gray clay. And you know all of the incredible things it could turn into, and that you have the ability to turn it into. And I think that's beautiful. It is such a desired process from the potter. So then, as the clay, are we desiring that process to become that something incredible and that work of art? Or are we not allowing ourselves to have that because we want to stay as that lump of clay, because we don't want the discomfort of allowing the potter to make us into what would please the potter to make us into?
Yeah, that is so good. Yeah, you nailed it. You nailed it. Well, Kari, it's so good that you are on here. Do you have any closing thoughts at all?
I don't think so. I just think, be willing to allow the potter to create what the potter envisions. Because as clay, we can't make ourselves into things. We don't have the ability to make our own selves into beautiful works of art. It takes a potter to come in and do it. And so we have to allow the potter to do it. Be okay with what can be uncomfortable, and be okay with not being in control, because the potter has a beautiful and perfect vision for what he wants you to become.
That's such a great closing statement. Be okay with being uncomfortable, and being what God wants us to be. So, wow. Thank you, Kari, again for coming on. I know that the listeners love you, and I'm so grateful that I got to have you on again.
Thanks for having me.
It's always fun to chit chat with you. So if you're listening and you haven't gotten a copy of my devotional, the link is in the show notes. And also too, if you haven't gotten a companion journal, or if you have a journal already, great. But if you don't have the companion journal, the link is also in the show notes. And there's lots of presents for the making here if you want to get one for somebody. Thanks again, Kari. And
Thank you.
until tomorrow, keep rinsing, reflecting, and repeating. God bless you.
Bye.